Today, we've asked three of our foreign correspondents to join us to give us some insight into the different geopolitical perspectives which have driven the international response to the war so far, and which ultimately, alongside military developments on the ground, are likely to have a key influence on its outcome. So I'm very happy to welcome our China correspondent, Dennis Staunton, our Berlin correspondent, Derek Scally, and our Europe correspondent, Naomi O'Leary. Hello to you all.
Hi.
Hello to you.
Naomi, can I go to you first, please? I mean, Henry Kissinger had a famous quote about a question, rather. He said, "Who do I call if I want to speak to Europe?" Is the answer to that question any clearer at all after the last 12 months?
I think it is. I think that the war has caused a sudden consolidation in the Western alliances. It's repaired relations substantially between the UK and the EU, and suddenly have really close coordination across the Atlantic. And you saw really concrete examples of this, like, diplomats from the EU actually going to make calls to Washington from the UK embassy and so on. There's this very closely coordinated reaction and sort of realization that on great issues, they are very much on the same page. And there's also been structural developments, for example, within the European Commission. It's long been the case that Washington has had very strong, very old relations with member state governments. But now what we see is that on the level of like civil servants and officials, there's a recognition that of the role of the Commission, not just in sort of enacting what member states decide, but also at times leading. So you can have the European Commission, for example, pushing forward something on sanctions, and the value of coordinating with the Commission as a central point in terms of what the EU is doing, particularly on measures like economic sanctions.
So economic sanctions obviously form a very important part of that in terms of a European-wide policy. But there are other big things too, aren't there? I mean, most notably the two that strikes us are our energy policy has been turned upside down by these events, and also defence policy.
Very profound transformation in both. In terms of energy, this is like a line in the sand. Prior to this, the reliance of the EU on Russian hydrocarbons was extreme, particularly for economies like Germany, with this convenient arrangement for cheap gas that underpinned German industry and so on. And that relationship has now been broken, and I don't think it's going to be repaired. And what we've seen is these extraordinary developments towards decarbonisation, which would have seemed unthinkable at some times. But now the green agenda has a very, very hard-headed economic rationale and strategic rationale. So we see movements like the European Parliament confirming a date for the phase out of the combustion engine, massive steps forward like that, which, yes, like I said, would have seemed unthinkable. I think that it's seemed to be happening slowly and then all at once. And then on defence, there's a nuance there. So it's true that the EU has taken steps that it never took before. For example, using a common fund to essentially reimburse member states for paying for military supplies for Ukraine. But also what this invasion has done is reveal the real weakness of the EU as a defence player and the extent to which it relies on the United States. It's really revealed that, confirmed it, showed EU cooperation on defence to be extremely paltry. And in absence of that, then what's happened is the EU has openly acknowledged its reliance on the United States really for defence purposes and declared very much closer cooperation with NATO. So we'll see a greater sort of integration and cooperation with NATO going forward, I think.
And there's a huge amount in all that, some of which we'll return to. I'm going to go to Dennis in a moment, but just one last question, because another thing which has happened as a result of this, it seems, is a sort of a rebalancing of power across the European Union as a whole, as for obvious reasons, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe have been most vocal and most active, as they're the countries that are most affected by these events.
Yeah, I mean, the authority of France and Germany and Western Europe more broadly was really undermined by the fact of the invasion and how unprepared they were, and the how foolish many of their particularly economic and trade policies were revealed to be. And simultaneously, the more eastern member states, the Baltics and so on, were revealed to have been correct in their assessment of Vladimir Putin and his intentions to invade and his rather menacing policy towards them as well. So suddenly the sort of weight of authority on defence, security in the wider European region, that suddenly fell to the east. And so we've had that perspective take a much more central position in the general EU. So certainly on security and defence, that the weight of opinion in the EU has shifted eastward.
Derek, if I can go to you, I mean, these policies which Naomi's describing there can seem quite abstruse and high level, but these things are having an impact on the ground, on people's lives. I'm reading with interest your feature today from Munster in Germany, which is, I never knew this, but I found it out from your piece this morning, is probably the most significant military city in Germany, and what's actually going on there and how people's lives have actually changed over the last 12 months.
Yes, Germany likes to keep its military out of sight. When you have a history like Germany's, there's always been a huge ambivalence or negativity towards anything military. So Munster is a town; it's hidden in the forest between Hamburg and Hanover. And I went there because it's become a hub. It's where Germany is meeting its European commitments to train Ukrainians on using tanks and defense systems and weapon systems. And it was quite an eye-opener, really. I mean, all these tanks that we've been hearing about these last weeks and months, the Leopard 2 tanks and so on, there they are sitting around. It's like a car rental except for tanks. And the Ukrainians are coming over, being brought over. We're not being told how. We're not given precise numbers on how many. But this is basically just day and night. If you'd said a year ago, oh yeah, Germany's going to be exporting tanks to Ukraine, they're going to be training them in Germany and sending them over, this was just absolutely unthinkable. And I think, as Naomi said, it's literally just day and night compared to where we were a year ago. In Germany, it's been a painful experience for them, but the fact that they're now doing this, a year is on the one hand a long time, but we're talking about sort of the collapse of illusions and a change in really the post-Cold War era. Even in many respects, the post-war era, Germany is now in a place it never wanted to be in and never wanted to go there, but now it's sort of facing up to some harsh realities and many shattered illusions. And I think this military base and the reality there, the realpolitik, really was quite stark.
But it's been a very uneven process, hasn't it? There was that very striking speech early on by the Chancellor to the Bundestag, basically, speaking about a complete reversal of German policy as it had been up until then. But then there have been kind of recurring criticisms, I'm not sure how fair they are, maybe you could tell me, of Germany dragging its feet in comparison to the support which has been given to Ukraine by other Western countries.
Yes, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, Germany has annoyed many of its neighbours, east and west, in recent years, and particularly since the start of the Ukraine debate. But the last couple of weeks have been fascinating because let's just take the tanks issue. There was an argument that the Leopard 2 tanks made by a German company, they are the best tanks in the world, and that they need to be on the Eastern Front, Ukraine's Eastern Front with Russia. And the argument was that Germany is not only not supplying its own tanks, but it's preventing other countries re-exporting their tanks, which is a term of sale. Once you buy German tanks, you cannot just pass them on without permission from Germany. And this was really building and building. There was quite a lot of tension over this. And what we then saw is in the last weeks, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, said, OK, we'll provide 14 tanks. And what we've now seen is a huge silence from a lot of the other countries, some of whom were pressing Germany and arguing that Germany's holding everything up. So the Germans are it's almost like things have turned on their head, and now Chancellor Scholz and the Germans are waiting for other people to sign up and provide tanks. So Germany is absolutely determined. It doesn't want to be at the head of the posse. It doesn't want to be at the back. It wants to be somewhere in the middle. And it doesn't want any solo runs. So it really is in a dilemma because unless other people act, it doesn't want to be seen to be the only people supplying tanks to Ukraine, battle tanks to Ukraine, because what are the consequences? So, and also Olaf Scholz is dealing with a hugely ambivalent German public. The last time there was a poll on this, it was just before he made the tanks announcement, and 40% of Germans felt that what they were doing up until then, sending ammunition, sending equipment, and sending weapons systems, 40% said that's about enough. And only a quarter of people felt they should be doing more. So that may have shifted a little bit since then, but there's huge ambivalence here that at the end of the day, these are tanks, these are battle tanks, these are weapons of war, weapons of death. This is not somewhere Germany ever wanted to be. And while it doesn't want to be holding things up, it doesn't want to be seen to be rushing into things either.
Dennis, the view of this is very different from where you are, isn't it? Maybe you could explain to our listeners what the position of Xi Jinping's government is on the war.
China is, it would say it is neutral on the war, but it's a kind of a complicated form of neutrality. So China didn't endorse the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year, but it also hasn't condemned it. And while China repeats all the time that it believes that territorial sovereignty and integrity must be respected, it also shares the Russian analysis that the root cause of this conflict is NATO expansion, is American aggression. And so from China's perspective, what the United States and its allies did in the 1990s was that they squandered an opportunity to have a generous settlement with the vanquished enemy in the Soviet Union, and instead that in contradiction to a number of promises made, it pursued this form of NATO expansion. And so they would see that the Americans essentially are in inviting the Chinese to come and join the the collective West in this in supplying weapons to Ukraine and in sanctioning Russia. That essentially they're inviting China to help them to deal with Russia so they can then focus on dealing with China and confronting China and preventing China's rise as an economic, technological and military power. So it does look very different from China.
And yet there is a sort of conflict of interest within China, isn't it, which has to be balanced. On the one hand, these events have drawn Russia further into the sphere of influence of China, and it stands to benefit from that. And we see it using more Russian energy and having more Russian trade because of the sanctions with the West. On the other hand, China also has to balance that with what's extremely important to it, which are its own trade interests in the West, its relationships with Europe and the United States.
Yes. Before the war, famously, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin said that they had a partnership which had no limits. But in fact, that partnership has very clear limits. It's not an alliance. China doesn't do alliances with people. It's got one with North Korea, but that's about the only one. And there's also, it's not clear just how far China is prepared to go. One thing that China has been very careful to do, for example, is to avoid breaching any Western sanctions against Russia. And in the same way that despite what a certain amount of saber rattling from Washington and from Brussels over the last few days, there is no evidence as yet that China has been supplying lethal military equipment to Russia, whereas obviously the Western powers have been supplying lethal military weapons to Ukraine. So they haven't been doing anything of that nature. So there are limits, and they've also warned Russia very clearly that it should not use nuclear weapons under any circumstances. Having said all of that, China is providing economic support, diplomatic support. It's buying Russian energy. It's selling Russia cars and many of the other things that it's not getting from the West anymore. And also very clearly, it's not in China's interest that Russia should lose this war, because the last thing that China wants is a large country with a large border to its north falling into the realm of the American sphere of influence. And so what China is looking for is a peace settlement, and as soon as possible, partly because the longer this goes on, the greater the danger is that Russia will lose, and also the greater the damage potentially is to China's relationship with the West. And China and the West are so entangled economically. China's priority right now, after it's emerged from zero COVID, is to get the economy going again and to plug itself back into the global trading system. And so this war is getting in the way of that. in seeking peace, China has a lot of support elsewhere in the global south, where a lot of these countries, they feel that their interests have not been taken into account as the West has sought support for this war, and they feel as if they're affected downstream by everything from food supplies to economic instability. And they also share with China a resistance to the idea of American hegemony. They seek a multipolar system. They're skeptical about the current rules-based international order, partly because every iteration of this rules-based international order, going back to the Treaty of Westphalia and on to its most recent one after the Second World War, has been designed by white people of European extraction. And the last iteration, it was designed, this current rules-based settlement was designed before decolonization. And of course, what everybody also notices is that the rules don't apply to the United States, that the United States tears up the rules when it feels like it, whether that's in Iraq, in Kosovo, the list goes on. And so there's a great deal of skepticism which China shares with various other countries in the global south about all of this entire military conflict. And certainly they would feel that the best approach to this is actually to seek peace as soon as possible.
Naomi, the position which Dennis articulates there, the position of China and of many other countries outside Europe and the West, is occasionally articulated by vocal opponents of the war on the left and the right of European politics, but isn't generally shared by the centre and the mainstream. But the question does arise this week, particularly as people look back over the last 12 months. What is the end game here realistically, and how much of a disjunction is there between the stated aims of full-throated support for Ukraine to fully retain its national sovereignty and some sort of compromise that might be necessary to end the human suffering?
I think that the attitudes towards that question have shifted since the outbreak of the invasion. Initially, you might remember, it wasn't expected that Kiev would actually hold on. So they were expected to lose quite quickly. And then, Russia being in command of the Ukrainian capital, there would have to be some kind of negotiation on the basis of that fact. But that isn't what happened. So because of that surprise, everybody's had to readjust their expectations and readjust them towards what the Ukrainians want, which they suddenly have more position to argue for because they've managed to push back the Russians. The invasion failed in its initial aims, and they actually, pushed back the Russian army in significant gains in the summer and autumn. So that changed the picture a lot. And something that I've noticed is that among EU leaders, whereas once, and in the early months, you might have, heard little subtle hints about, you're going to have to come to a negotiation eventually. That rhetoric very much hardened, and everyone began to say this is very much a piece that Ukraine has to define. And what the phrase that you hear now is that the European support is there for as long as it takes, for a peace that Ukraine is happy with. And I think what's at the heart of that I did an interview which will be published this weekend with David O'Sullivan, who is the EU's head of sanctions enforcement. He's a special envoy for sanctions. And he happens to be Irish. And I asked him, how did he put the case to third countries that weren't convinced about the EU's attachment to Ukrainian victory? How did he explain to them why it matters to Europe? And what was the argument he put forward? And he said, this is existential for Europe. And I said, well, what do you mean existential? And he said, existential in that we don't believe that if Vladimir Putin wins in Ukraine, that it will stop there. We believe that he would invade other countries. So that's what's at the heart of this. Even if there was a peace settlement now with Russia, and they were allowed to keep some part of Ukraine or something like that, there isn't a belief in Europe that would end it. They think that would actually encourage Russia to push for more. So that's why there's an attachment to the idea of pushing Russia out and not allowing a victory to Putin that might encourage further imperialistic ambitions.
We're going to take a very quick break, but before we do, just to remind you that if you want to read all of Naomi's and Derek's and Dennis's journalism, along with all the other journalism in the Irish Times and on irishtimes.com, and if you're not a subscriber, why not subscribe now at irishtimes.com/subscribe. We'll be back after this. And welcome back. Derek, Naomi was just talking there before the break about the increased support for Ukraine over the course of the last year. And one of the factors in that, I think it's fair to say, has been the very effective lobbying, pressurization of the Kyiv government and Zelensky in particular. I mean, is there any sense underneath the surface in the German establishment that they're being kind of pushed into something by outside forces? Is there any sense of resentment there as to how effective that campaign for support has been?
Well, I think with Chancellor Scholz, he came into power in December of 2021, so he was in power literally 2 months, and he has war in Europe on his hands. And since then, what we've very much seen is he's very much anxious to be seen as his own man. He really digs in when pressure is coming, pressure to do this, pressure to do that. It's a common line in Germany. People say they expect German leadership. They want leadership from us, but they also want to dictate the direction and the pace of what we do. So I think we're seeing with Scholz, also what we've seen under Angela Merkel, a sense of Germany very tentatively, very slowly trying to define what it wants for itself in crisis situations like this. And you could see that a little bit at the Munich Security Conference last week. So Olaf Scholz was talking to international diplomats and politicians, and he said, we want to continue to strike the balance on the best possible for support for Ukraine and avoiding unintended escalation. Now, critics would say, well, you're providing tanks. Is that not an escalation? But he said it's not true that our arms are prolonging the war. The opposite is the case. And but what I thought was interesting when just after Emmanuel Macron spoke, he made no reference to Scholz. As far as I could tell, they actually hadn't met each other at that point, but he was talking very much in his speech about the need to create a durable, credible peace. Now, he did talk about closer European cooperation on defence and nuclear deterrence, but he was very much looking at the time after. So I thought that was interesting that while in Germany in opposition and on the left and the right, there is very much talk for what is the game plan, what is the exit plan, where are we going, what are we doing with these tanks. Scholz himself seems to have hardened his line, and he's very much in step with Joe Biden on this, that whatever it takes, as long as it takes for Ukraine. Interestingly, the opposition to this line is quite strong in Germany from sort of older voices like the 95-year-old philosopher Jürgen Habermas. He was warning last week about, we need to be careful we don't slide more or less unnoticed, sort of sleepwalk beyond the threshold for a third world war. And this weekend in Berlin, there's going to be a rally on Saturday at the Brandenburg Gate for people who are demanding that Germany be at the forefront of the diplomatic push for peace. And almost 600,000 people have signed a petition demanding that Germany should be that force for peace. And the headline of the petition is, negotiation does not mean capitulation. Negotiation means making compromises on both sides. Now, many people in Germany are infuriated by that, and they say there are no compromises to be made with Putin at the moment, and we cannot be demanding over Ukraine's head that it somehow acts this way or that way. But it's a very mixed, very ambivalent, very worried Germany that we have. But what we have seen in the last year is that Germany very much emerging as a country that wants to make up its own mind about what it does, at what point, and quite surprised that sometimes its critics are far less bolshy on certain things, including battle tank deliveries, than it has actually proven to be itself.
Yeah, but isn't the reality and isn't the fact of war, doesn't history tell us that once war breaks out, it sort of supersedes everything else? And it strikes me, looking at the sort of the establishment position in Germany and the opposition to it as you describe it there, that the establishment, most of our governments are waiting to see what happens on the battlefield, because that is what is going to have the greatest impact on how things play out, if they ever are to play out, in the negotiating room.
Indeed, I mean, just Germany's history. I mean, it's war history. I mean, it's a dilemma, whichever way it looks. It feels culturally, emotionally, historically a huge burden is the 22 million Soviet Red Army and Russian dead. And it also feels, Ukraine were the killing fields of Nazi Germany. So where does it go there? What is its obligation not then to perhaps to the Western rules-based order, the post-war second chance that Germany was given? And nobody here really, there is a sort of a sinking feeling, I think, among many Germans that somehow people are being sucked into something, less sleepwalking than being sucked in. And of course, Germany is a huge supplier, manufacturer of the tanks, of weapon systems, and so on. So it's I think a year on, there's just a terrible sort of sinking feeling in Germany that something is underway that may not be able to be stopped at this stage.
Dennis, I'm interested in your thoughts on this, not just because of your China perspective, but also as a former correspondent in Berlin and Brussels and London and Washington. You have a very good overview of this and the way that these different power centers sort of intersect with each other. I was listening to a podcast with the former White House official Fiona Hill, who served under Obama and famously testified in Trump's first impeachment hearing. And she had some interesting observations on Vladimir Putin, on whom she is a specialist. And she really said that, he will be waiting for any sign of weakness in relation to this. She described him as somebody who's learned his adversarial skills not through chess, which is the parallel people often look to, but for judo. So he's always searching for weakness and for advantage. And as Naomi said earlier, any sort of a truce offers him all kinds of weaknesses and advantages. So we're in this moment of stasis here. And if China wants to get people to a negotiating table, does it have any real leverage to get people there?
I think it's difficult, and as you describe it, the logic of the position that you're describing, and of the position that Naomi was quoting and describing, is that you just keep going with war, because if you can't find a compromise, if there is no compromise that is acceptable, then the logic of that is that you keep going. But if you go back to Clausewitz and you think about what is the purpose of war, what is the purpose of military force, what's the use of military force, it is, as Derek was describing it, it is actually to shape, that you use events in the battlefield to shape what happens at the diplomatic negotiating table. It is to strengthen your position in an ongoing negotiation. And now that can happen. And so, this famous notion that it's the continuation of politics by other means, that it actually is, these things are connected. And so you have to, at some stage, and it may be that where the Western powers have found themselves now, is that they believe that you just have to have months more of killing and dying in Ukraine before you can start speaking about the idea of having a negotiated settlement. But whatever that negotiated settlement is going to be, it's very likely to be one that's an unhappy one for both sides. And it's unlikely, for example, to see the withdrawal of Russian forces from all of Ukraine's territory, including Crimea. That seems to me to be very, very unlikely as an outcome. And if you're not going to consider creative solutions to other territorial and other questions surrounding the future of Ukraine, then I think you are postponing the moment of finding peace. I think what China has in its favor is, first of all, it has alliances, or rather, it has alliances of interest, and it has its view is shared by many people around the global South. Some of these are countries that the United States and its allies need for one reason or another. And then the other factor, which I suppose that China would be thinking in terms of, is how much more do people in Europe, for example, want to continue with this, and the disjunction between what the elites in a country like Germany and the commentariat are saying and what at least a large number of the people seem to be thinking is one which is, I think, something that's a space that people in China might offer, at least at some stage in the future, some opportunity for pressuring politicians into pursuing peace rather than more war.
Would they be right in thinking that, Naomi? One of the things that strikes me is that Meloni, the new leader in Italy, very much turned her back on the previous populist right position on Putin and Russia, and seems to be very much signed up to the current policy. Is there a sign in other European countries of nervousness about a revolt against this, as Dennis describes it, elite position?
There was very much nervousness about a public revolt before the winter, because there was a real concern that it would be a hard winter, that it would be very cold, that people would struggle a lot with energy bills, and that public opinion could turn very dramatically against support for Ukraine. I think that there's actually been encouragement in that didn't actually materialize as much as was feared. So it depends on the country. Some countries have more of a public opinion challenge to deal with than others. Derek was outlining the situation in Germany. In Italy, there's quite a divided public as well, which is divided in also the current coalition government. And Giorgia Meloni, like you said, has to continually prove herself that she's a friend of Ukraine and that she's on board and that she's that she supports NATO and all of that. She has to keep reiterating that because of what her coalition partners say. Other countries have had issues, like Czechia, for example, ahead of their presidential election, had big protests, but ultimately the winning candidate was the pro-Western alliance candidate.